The Supreme Court has released its decisions on a few key gerrymandering cases in the past couple weeks. One is a case out of Wisconsin, Gill versus Whitford, and another is a case out of Maryland, Benesek versus Lamont. And these deal with politically partisan gerrymandering, in that after the census is taken every 10 years, the states get to redraw their districts in their states to account for population fluctuations and all. But the problem is with politically partisan gerrymandering is that if a party controls the state, if one political party controls all the apparatuses of the state, then they could potentially tilt the balance in their state to favor their own political party. They could redraw the maps in order to dilute the opposition party, spread them out so their votes count less, and redraw the map so that there are people who are affiliated with their own party, their votes count a little bit more. And these are the accusations that are brought in these gerrymandering cases. So in the first case out of Wisconsin, Gill versus Whitford, gerrymandering was in favor of the Republicans who control Wisconsin. The case regarding gerrymandering in Wisconsin, though, was rejected because the plaintiffs, it was ruled that they lacked standing. This was a 9-0 decision by the Supreme Court justices. They found that the plaintiffs had to demonstrate how they were personally affected by the gerrymandering and not just the Democratic, population as a whole. So that's thrown back to the lower courts to be relitigated. They can amend their case. In Maryland, a similar ruling, the court unanimously ruled against the Republican challengers because they basically waited too long, the court said, to apply for an injunction. So, out of these cases, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote, quote, "We leave for another day consideration of other possible theories of harm not presented here, and whether those theories might present justiciable claims giving rise to statewide remedies." This is a debate that has been ongoing for decades, and that whether or not this issue of politically partisan gerrymandering is even justiciable at all, whether it can be brought to the Supreme Court, whether it can be argued to violate your constitutional rights to have your vote count. There's been debates among the justices on whether or not that can be allowed. This was first ruled on in 1986 with Davis versus Bandemer, where the Supreme Court recognized the constitutional right to a non-gerrymandered district. And since then, it's been debated amongst the justices whether or not that holds. And one of the most recent cases that dealt with that debate was Veith versus Jubilerer in 2004, and that case did not receive a majority of votes. Instead, it received a plurality. And Antonin Scalia, he wrote that he wanted to basically overturn Davis versus Bandemer and make politically partisan gerrymandering non-justiciable. That it would have to be handled, somewhere else, but not in the courts, and especially the Supreme Court. But that view did not hold, did not garner the majority of votes on the Supreme Court, and so Davis versus Bandemer stands. But Justice Kennedy wrote in Veith versus Jubilerer that he's the swing vote, so he didn't necessarily totally endorse the view that it is justiciable, but he also didn't endorse that it was non-justiciable. So he wrote that politically partisan gerrymandering, it could be justiciable, but just that we don't have a workable standard for assessing the constitutionality of gerrymandered districts. So it could be, we have to have a standard. It's not yet conceived, but it could be, justiciable in front of the Supreme Court, and we'll have to try to think of a way to handle those cases. Now, the frustration that many Americans feel towards these decisions is that they're non-decisions. The Supreme Court basically kicked the can down the road on this as well, but they're being sent back to lower courts so they can be relitigated and amended, and they can be brought back before the Supreme Court one day. But it's a problem for many Americans because the idea that the gerrymandered districts that they didn't necessarily rule against, that those districts still stand. Those gerrymandered states still exist, and they will remain in place, and they'll remain in place through the upcoming elections. So consequently, the politicians that win those races in these partisanly engineered districts will remain in office and are still able to pass laws. It was commented on by Justin Levitt, a former top Justice Department official and current professor at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. And he was commenting about the Whitford complaint, saying that it's a bit different than in most civil cases, because in civil cases, if there's harm done, then that will be addressed, and the civil case will either block the harm from happening, or it will, make the plaintiff whole again after the harm has been done. But he had to say about this how it's different, this gerrymandering issue. He said, quote, "People elected under unfair rules and by unfair systems are sitting and making policy. In the meantime, policy doesn't stop. There is no way to make a plaintiff whole after an unconstitutional election happens, and all of the policy that results sticks." So after all of the policies that are enacted by the people who were elected through these partisan redistricting schemes, they still exist, and those are affecting real people in real time. So how do you then address the harm done to people by politicians who are unfairly elected? Gerrymandering is a problem in states that are controlled by both Republicans and Democrats. Democrats, it's a problem in states like Maryland, but there are a few more that are controlled by Republicans that have this issue of politically partisan gerrymandering. And there's a reason for this. There's a reason why more Republican states are doing this, or have done this in the past, and now are being heard by the Supreme Court. So the gerrymandered districts that are primarily being challenged are states controlled by Republicans, and this is basically because of the strategy that was implemented in the wake of the 2008 victory of Barack Obama. After Barack Obama won the 2008 election, conservatives, they were outraged, and then they were focusing on winning back the legislative branch. So the organization that led this campaign was the Republican State Leadership Committee, and the strategy that they used to achieve their goal is called Red Map. And Red Map uses computer technology to redraw districts in key states so that the outcome will favor Republican candidates. The Leadership Committee raised over $30 million, and a lot of the money came from big donors such as Walmart. And then this $30 million was distributed to the states of Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Wisconsin. And this was all to work on the project of taking back Congress. One person who was involved with this Red Map redistricting scheme was Karl Rove. Karl Rove's a Republican political consultant. He worked in the Bush administration, and he's now a Fox News contributor. During this time, in 2010, he wrote a column in which he stated, quote, "He who controls redistricting can control Congress." Here, Karl Rove recognizes that through redistricting, one can take back a whole branch of the government. Now, whether this is fair or not, that's what is being discussed in these gerrymandering cases. Red Map worked. In the 2012 election, there were 107 seats at stake in those 7 Republican states. The Republican candidates outpolled the Democrats in those states by only a slim margin. The Republican candidates won 16.7 million votes, while the Democratic candidates won 16.4 million votes. But despite winning just slightly more votes, and instead of getting just over half of the seats, Republicans won 73 seats, while the Democrats won only 34 seats. So the Republicans won way more seats in those elections, even though they only received just a few 100,000 more votes. and the Democrats won 34. Now, nationwide in that election, in the 2012 election, the Democratic congressional candidates received more votes overall, yet they lost seats as the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives. We also know that third-party candidates received around 3% of votes nationwide, yet received zero representation in Congress. So the problem continues with gerrymandering, and there was a case out of North Carolina that dealt with gerrymandering as well, and this was something that people who were focusing on this issue of gerrymandering were looking at, because this was another opportunity for the court to decide one way or the other on the justiciability or whether or not this politically partisan gerrymandering was constitutional or not. But before that was brought, Justice Kagan was trying to come up with a way that to address these issues of gerrymandering and to come up with a standard for addressing those issues. And this was also in an attempt to bring Justice Kennedy around to making a definitive decision on this issue of gerrymandering and align him with the more liberal wing of the court. So Kagan was suggesting that the court could focus on how partisan gerrymandering burdens the voters' First Amendment freedom of association, and that it weakens their right to come together as a collective in a political party and elect candidates that they choose. If it burdens those voters, if they cannot come together and express themselves at the polls, then we may have a First Amendment issue, and this is what Kagan was arguing and hoping that Anthony Kennedy would come around and side with her. But two things happened. The North Carolina case was also sent back to the lower courts, and also recently, in the past couple days, Justice Kennedy announced that he was retiring. So this leaves a seat open that will have to be filled by President Donald Trump. This has major ramifications for the future court cases, and in particular the gerrymandering issue. If the conservative wing gains another justice who will decline to rule on the constitutionality of partisan gerrymandering districts by making it a non-justiciable issue, then that will seriously threaten our democracy. The retirement of Justice Kennedy comes as a great surprise to many people. It's important at this moment in time to remember how Supreme Court cases affect us, how Supreme Court cases affect the country, and how they also affect the democratic process. If the vacancy left open by Justice Kennedy is filled but with another conservative activist justice, such as another Neil Gorsuch, this could be a problem for issues involving gerrymandering and many other issues down the road that may arise. So it's important for people to be vigilant with how this nomination and confirmation process goes, because it can affect us for decades to come.